Hello everyone and welcome to EmploySure's Bully-Free Workplace webinar. We are pleased to welcome our presenter for today, Lawrence McLean. This webinar is live and interactive. You're encouraged to post questions to the presenter throughout the presentation. If you're experiencing any technical issues during the webinar, please dial our support team on 1-800-733-416. This number is also listed in the chat box. I'd now like to pass you over to Lawrence to begin.
Great, thank you for that, and welcome everybody. My name's Lawrence McLean. I'm a Senior Claims Advisor at EmploySure, and as the slide in the presentation shows, I'll be talking today about bully-free workplaces and really about how we can identify bullying in the workplace, how we can prevent it from occurring, what proactive steps we can take to try and minimize bullying in the workplace, and also how we can deal with any complaints of bullying. So I'll go through the slides, I'll talk about each one of those factors, and then at the end, so I'll do that for about 40-45 minutes, and then at the end I'll talk about, or I'll leave the floor open for any questions that anybody might have. So as previously mentioned, if you have any questions, please let us know. I'm more than happy to answer those for you. So in terms of this Pink Shirt Day bullying webinar that I'm giving at the moment, we'll talk about what constitutes bullying, harassment and discrimination. Often a difficult question to answer, and a question that comes up with a lot of employers and employees as well. We'll identify the grounds to defend discrimination in the workplace, equip you guys to meet your legal obligations, talk about what a reasonable management action is. This is often where bullying issues arise when an employee is given an instruction by their manager and that often taken the wrong way, and as a result that employee may feel like they're being bullied. We'll also talk about how to conduct difficult conversations with an employee, particularly once they've already raised a claim of bullying, and then also talk about how to deal with tricky situations that could otherwise result in a claim. Hopefully the whole point of this presentation being that you guys can avoid having a claim in the first place. So as some of you may or may not be aware, New Zealand has the second highest rate of workplace bullying in the world. And according to a study of 1,700 people, it's found that 1 in 5, so 20% of New Zealand workers had experienced workplace bullying. So it is a very prevalent occurrence throughout the workplace, and something that can cause very significant issues for employers and for employees as well. So a really topical and really important subject to address. So I guess the first point, and probably one of the most important things to talk about, is what is bullying. So the definition that WorkSafe have provided is a repeated and unreasonable behaviour directed towards a worker or group of workers that can lead to physical or psychological harm. So the word worker there means that it's not just employees, it's also contractors, it's also volunteers, it's also other people that come into the workplace. So it could apply to people outside of just the strict employer-employee relationship. The other two most important words in there are repeated. So it has to be a behaviour that occurs more than once, a one-off issue that an employee faces or claims to be bullying generally won't count to be bullying, and it also has to be unreasonable. So it has to be something that a reasonable person would see as being bullying or as being an action attacking that employee essentially. And I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide as well about what isn't bullying. So there's a few examples there of what bullying are. So it can be physical, verbal, or social. It's also behaviour that creates a risk to a worker's health and safety. So bullying is a health and safety issue, which means that it is a subject that is mainly dealt with by WorkSafe. So alongside looking at the use of chemicals and equipment and everything like that, WorkSafe also look at bullying. And what that means is that there's a potential risk, and we'll talk about a little bit more about this in a minute as well, a risk of prosecution by WorkSafe if they find that the bullying has caused significant issues. It's also from the perspective of the victim, not the perpetrator. And what that means is that someone can often say a comment which they don't intend to be negative or they don't intend to be bullying, but which is interpreted, or which would normally be interpreted by the person receiving it as being bullying behaviour. That doesn't necessarily mean that just because somebody feels like they're being bullied, that they are being bullied. It is an objective test, which means that a reasonable person in that employee situation would have or would need to be found to have been bullied in that situation. So just because somebody feels like they're being bullied doesn't necessarily mean that they are being bullied. And that often creates some difficulties in terms of working out whether somebody genuinely has been bullied or not. But I'll talk about a few more tips, or I'll give you a few more tips about how we can perhaps clarify that a little bit further as well. And there's some examples there as well: physical or verbal abuse or threats, spreading rumours, unjustified criticism or complaints, deliberate exclusion from workplace activities, repeated teasing and practical jokes. It can also include things like name calling, insults, isolation, overwork, undermining behaviour. A whole list of different actions can constitute bullying. But probably just as important as what is bullying is what is not bullying. So we've got some examples here of what bullying is not. So this is something that WorkSafe have agreed to as well. So setting high performance standards, that's not going to be bullying. Providing constructive feedback and legitimate advice or peer review. A manager requiring a reasonable verbal or written instruction. Warning or disciplining workers in line with a code of conduct or a business's policies. A single incident of unreasonable behaviour. So remember that bullying is repeated behaviour. A reasonable management instruction delivered in a reasonable way. Differences in opinions or personality clashes, often a big topic. Personality clashes are quite a big grey area, to be honest, where there is a very fine line between a personality clash and an instance of bullying. But as the slide says there, so long as it doesn't escalate into bullying, harassment or violence, then hopefully we can isolate that just to a personality clash and one-off or occasional instances of forgetfulness, rudeness or tactlessness. So you can see there's a common theme there of reasonableness or being one-off events, and that goes back to that definition. So bullying has to be unreasonable and it has to be repeated. So even 2 instances of a behaviour, of an unreasonable behaviour, can constitute bullying. But generally with bullying behaviour, you would expect to see something happening over a number of occasions in a continuous period of time, but not always. And that reasonable test, well, that's something that's often very difficult to work out, because what is reasonable can vary from person to person, from workplace to workplace, and even from city to city or country to country. Obviously, with some workplaces, things like construction sites, you might have a more robust, for lack of a better word, culture at that workplace, which does involve swearing or does involve, a bit of teasing or a bit of banter. And when you look at it in that context, it may not be bullying. And when you compare that to perhaps an office environment, that same behaviour can be found to be bullying. So that's where that reasonableness test comes in and something to look at. In addition to bullying, it crosses over quite a lot with harassment and discrimination. So harassment is sexual harassment, racial harassment, or really any repeated, unwanted, unjustified behaviour which another person finds offensive or humiliating, which ultimately has a negative effect on that person's employment. The difference between sexual harassment and bullying is that sexual harassment is subjective, which means that regardless of the intent of the person making the comment, if somebody interprets something as being a sexually offensive comment, then it will constitute sexual harassment. So it doesn't really matter the way that it's delivered or the way that it's intended. If it's interpreted in a negative way, then that can constitute sexual harassment. And racial harassment, again, along the same lines. I think we all know examples of people who, or examples of where sexual or racial harassment may have arisen. They are probably a little bit more easy to identify because they tend to be more explicit and relate to more narrow themes or more narrow instances. Discrimination is also another factor that crosses over with bullying. So discrimination, but for something to be discrimination, it must be a discriminatory action. So essentially highlighting or targeting a certain person based on a certain set of discriminatory grounds. So those are age, race, ethical or national origins, sex, sexual orientation, disability, religious or ethical beliefs, marital or family status, employment status, political opinion, or also involvement in union activities or industrial action. So you can also actually discriminate against somebody on the basis of whether they are or are not part of a union. So discrimination and harassment are kind of tangential to bullying. You may have an action that is both harassment and bullying, or both harassment and discrimination, or both discrimination and bullying. But not all instances of bullying will be harassment or discrimination. So they may cross over, but they may also be able to be separated out. And the effect of that is that it can give an employee or somebody who has been bullied or harassed or discriminated against different avenues to pursue if they wanted to complain or raise a claim against an employer or a business who may have subjected them to that sort of behaviour. And I'll explain a little bit more as well in a couple of slides about what the different avenues those people can go down. So how do we identify and manage bullying in the workplace? Identification's really important. These are proactive actions to try and head off any continual behaviour from occurring or any behaviour from escalating. So it's really around being aware of as I talked about previously, the workplace cultures and values. Often a lot of businesses have defined what the culture or values are, but equally so, it may be an unspoken culture or there may be unspoken values. So that can often be difficult sometimes to identify. Demonstrating the values, so being a good example to employees or to workers, making sure that you're actively looking out for instances of bullying or things that may be bullying, or even the precursor to bullying, so something that may escalate into being bullying or harassment or discrimination. And then also having the conversation about mental health and well-being in the workplace, because one of the significant effects of bullying and harassment and discrimination can be that it can significantly affect somebody's mental health and well-being. And I think there was an example a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, of an employee at Housing New Zealand who actually very unfortunately committed suicide because they said that they were being bullied by their employer and nothing was being done. So it can have very significant consequences on an employee. You also want to make sure that you're managing bullying in the workplace, so having good policies, good procedures in place to address those issues, always really, really helpful. Ensuring that those employees are also aware of the policies. There's no point having a policy in an employee's agreement and then they lock that away and never see that again. So reminding employees that they have the options to raise complaints or a process to follow if they want to address issues will always make it, will always show that an employee is acting a lot more reasonably and actually taking steps to address those sort of issues. Enabling access to training, as well as advice and support, not just for employees, but also for managers and owners as well. That's equally important. It is a two-way relationship, an employment relationship. So you want to be making sure that both sides are equipped to deal with these sorts of issues. And obviously, if there are issues of bullying and or harassment or discrimination in the workplace, it can have very significant impacts on the business. And even just one instance of bullying between one or for one particular person can actually spread out and have a domino effect throughout an entire business. Whether it's a small business, a medium business, or a very large business, these sort of issues can escalate very quickly and can very much spread throughout a workplace. We talked about kind of the mental health effects it could have on an employee. It could also have physical or biological effects on an employee as well. And as we talked about, in some cases, very, very tragic consequences for employees who are subject to bullying. Equally so, it could also cause issues in the culture of a workplace. And this is something that I've seen quite a lot in a number of workplaces, is a culture where this sort of behaviour occurs on a fairly regular basis, and an employer isn't really doing that much to address it, or even to show that they are acknowledging the issues or the behaviour in the workplace. And what that means for employees is that they often feel or aren't as motivated to do their work, a loss of productivity, it can affect the environment, it can also lead to high staff turnover, and obviously that has very significant financial consequences on a business. Having to hire, recruit, and train employees is a very expensive process. It can increase absenteeism. Often you get a lot of employees taking sick leave or in environments where this is prevalent. A lot of negativity, a lot of inhibition of innovation and creativity. And if it goes on for long enough, it can actually be a very, very difficult cycle to break. It often requires a lot of very in-depth work to create a positive culture where there is a very, very ingrained negative culture. So obviously the sooner we deal with these sort of issues, the better it's going to be for everybody involved, better for the employee, better for the business, better for the managers and owners of that business as well. It can also have reputational effects on a business. I think those are all pretty obvious. This is a very hot topic in the media at the moment. A lot of victims of bullying often will go to the media if they take their claim to the Employment Relations Authority or to the Employment Court. Those are all public decisions, which means that anybody can access those. And I know that the New Zealand Herald and the Stuff website love to go to those meetings or hearings and report on those sort of instances. There's actually a lot of politically active organisations out there as well who have a very big focus on bullying and sometimes even use a name and shame process to identify people or businesses who they think are bullying their employees. And we sort of talked a little bit about the financial costs as well. Reduced efficiency or productivity always has a negative effect on a business's finances. We talked about turnover, so recruitment fees, counselling, time, that's often a big factor as well. Having to deal with a lot of bullying claims or having to deal with an ingrained culture like that can be very time intensive or time expensive. And obviously it can also lead to an employee taking a claim. And as I'll talk about in the next slide, we've seen the amounts of the compensation that employees are receiving for bullying claims increase dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years or so. So it can have a very big, significant financial impact were an employer to lose a bullying claim or harassment claim or a discrimination claim. So what happens when it goes wrong? Well, I sort of talked about the different avenues that an employee can go down. These are essentially the 3 different types of formal complaints that they can make. So they can make a claim in the Employment Relations Authority. That's the body who deals mainly with employment claims. So if an employee says that they're being treated unfairly, being bullied in the workplace, and that their employer isn't doing anything to address that, or they end up having to leave the workplace because they just can't handle it anymore and they're being bullied too much and nothing's happening, then they may be able to raise an unjustified disadvantage or a constructive dismissal claim. Generally, they have 90 days to raise that claim from the last instance that the bullying occurred on. So if bullying is being happening over the last year or so, then so long as the employee raises that claim within 90 days from the last time it happened, they can actually still claim for that whole year of bullying if they want to. And if the authority, the Employment Relations Authority, do find that an employer has been bullying their employees or that the employee had to resign because of the bullying, then they can actually award that employee emotional compensation, lost wages, costs for representation, and they can also penalise or fine an employer as well. Previously, the type of emotional compensation you might have been looking at back in, say, 2013 or 14 was $3,000 to $5,000 per claim. Nowadays, you're looking at, on average, $15,000 for a claim of bullying if that employee were to be successful. But actually, the compensation amount is uncapped, so it can go well beyond that, and we've seen claims for $25,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 just for the emotional compensation, let alone the lost wages and other costs that are incurred. An employee can also go down the Human Rights Commission track. So the Human Rights Commission and the Human Rights Review Tribunal also deal more so generally with harassment and discrimination claims. an employee in that case has 12 months to raise that claim, so significantly longer. And actually the compensation and penalties in that forum can be significantly higher than in the Employment Relations Authority. So in the Human Rights Review Tribunal, there's been compensatory amounts of 90,000 all the way up to 120,000. So very, very significant penalties or compensation rather in that forum. And the last one is I talked about bullying being a health and safety issue. So if WorkSafe do decide to investigate an incident of bullying where they think it is a very long-term problem and something that's ingrained into the business that isn't being dealt with appropriately, then WorkSafe may also prosecute a bullying claim. It hasn't happened yet, but I am aware of a couple of instances where WorkSafe are actively investigating a number of bullying claims, and it's likely that in the next year or so we're going to see the first prosecution by WorkSafe of an employer for bullying not being dealt with correctly. And the prosecutions in the health and safety sphere, so for WorkSafe, are significantly higher than any of those forums. It can be a $50,000 fine for an individual and up to a $500,000 fine for a company. So it can be very, very significant penalties or fines for employers in those sort of situations. And also very, very costly and time-consuming to defend those sort of claims as well. So there can be very, very significant consequences of these sorts of claims that employees are raising. This is mainly the work that I do here at EmploySure. So my particular job is to deal with claims, so claims in the Employment Relations Authority, the Human Rights Commission, and WorkSafe prosecutions. Employment Relations Authority claims are definitely the biggest, definitely the first place that employees normally go, and I would say somewhere around 90% of bullying claims are dealt with in the Employment Relations Authority, and at the moment the rest are generally dealt with at the Human Rights Commission, and as I say, it's likely we're going to see some WorkSafe prosecutions coming in the near future as well. So how do we avoid this happening? Well, when I talked about the definition of bullying, I said it's a repeated and unreasonable behaviour. So that obviously brings the question up of what is reasonable and what is unreasonable. So a reasonable management action is, setting KPIs, key performance indicators, performance appraisals, giving constructive feedback in the right way, getting with underperformance or misconduct, modifying duties, changing hours, redeployment, any other change to an employee's employment, done in the right way. Those can all be very reasonable management actions. And a lot of employers, particularly once they've already dealt with a claim or already received a claim, or maybe sometimes when they look at the consequences of getting it wrong, are often sometimes very hesitant, and understandably so, to do some of these actions because they may result in a claim of bullying. But so long as they're done in a fair and reasonable way, and so long as an employer has good documentation and good policies in place, then those are reasonable actions to take. Obviously, an unreasonable action would be inflated criticism, particularly in front of colleagues or peers. Unfortunately, I still see that happening quite a lot. A lot of employers disciplining or criticizing employees in front of other people. And there really is, in my view at least, no justification to do that. Any sort of criticism, whether it's constructive or otherwise, should always be done in private with that employee to give them the dignity and give them the opportunity to genuinely engage in that process. And obviously, changing somebody's, anything about their employment actually, but including their work hours without notice or reason, can also be bullying as well. So there's many other examples of unreasonable management actions and many other examples of reasonable management actions, but those are a couple of issues that we often see that result in bullying claims. Obviously, just because somebody raises a claim doesn't mean that they have been bullied. And so what the next step we do is we look at this reasonable versus unreasonable, and to see if it actually is something that the employer genuinely needed to engage in order to run their business. So just because an employee feels offended, if that employer is doing it for the right reason, then it should normally be okay for that employer to keep going down that route. And as probably has become apparent already, as we'll kind of talk about in the back half of this presentation as well, it's all about balance. Does the person feel offended, intimidated, or humiliated? And also, would a reasonable person have anticipated the behaviour would offend, intimidate, or humiliate that person? So I talked about bullying being an objective test. What that means is that it has to be, we apply the reasonable person test. Would a reasonable person in that circumstance think that that was bullying behaviour? And trying to define what a reasonable person is something that there's a lot of debate around, and often what we spend a lot of time dealing with when it comes to a claim. But that is generally what the courts and authorities will look at when they determine whether bullying has been occurred or not, or has occurred or not. And that's really important because a lot of, or not a lot, but there are some people out there who are very sensitive to any sort of criticism at all, or any demands being made of them. And particularly when they have other stresses going on in their lives, this is probably the most common instance I see where bullying claims arise, is when an employee was going through a relationship difficulties, or going through a claim or a court battle for another instance. They may be going through a divorce, or maybe going through a custody battle, maybe going through a criminal proceeding. They may have some mental health issues. They may be struggling financially. Those can often make an employee a lot more sensitive to any behaviour that they're on the receiving end of. And that's why we apply that reasonable person test, just to make sure that just because somebody feels offended doesn't mean that they have been bullied. So when we're looking at whether it's worth taking action or not, there's a number of different things to look at. I'll be the first to say that it's not cheap to actually address these issues. It can often take a lot of time and a lot of dedication from management or from an employer to deal with these claims. But it's really about looking at, is the problem going to escalate? Are more people going to get involved? Is it going to cost, not just financial costs, but time and resources? And are there going to be legal complications that arise from doing nothing? And I think it's really about looking at all those factors and saying, is this something that we need to deal with right now? Or is it perhaps something that we can just wait and see how it goes? And I'm talking more about situations just before bullying occurs, because obviously if bullying does happen, an employer has a legal obligation to deal with it. But where there's kind of personality clashes going on, for example, or other negative cultural effects happening within the business, often a lot of employers will say, well, that's not bullying yet, so I'm not going to do anything about it. And what that can mean is that can very easily escalate into bullying, and sometimes it can be too late to deal with it once it already gets to that point. So often proactive behaviour is always beneficial. Sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not. It's about looking at what are the particular risks of not doing anything, what are the costs of doing nothing, who else is going to get involved. Sometimes when one person raises a claim, a whole lot of other employees also feel like they need to raise claims as well, and or get motivated to raise their claims as well. And is the problem obviously going to escalate? In terms of having conversations about, or having conversations in general, I guess, with employees, but also particularly having difficult conversations with employees, it's really good to really put yourself in the shoes and really have some empathy and some sympathy for employees or for workers in these situations. It's not always an easy thing to do. Often, employees can do things which are really frustrating, or for which employers really want to jump in and address those issues, and often may not have that much sympathy for an employee, particularly where they are causing a lot of issues in the workplace. But I always think it's beneficial to at least briefly step into the shoes of that person who's on the receiving end of behaviour, to determine whether perhaps something may be able to be interpreted as being bullying or unreasonable and repeated behaviour. So it's really about seeing and hearing the actions, behaviours and words of somebody, stepping out, stepping away if you're the person that is doing those actions or are taking those behaviours or are saying those words, to step away from that for a minute and say, well, how may these be interpreted? Making sure that when you are giving criticism or when you are having difficult conversations with employees or making changes they may not be happy with or having other conversations, that you're really putting context around it. Walking up to an employee and saying, you haven't done a very good job today, you need to get better, often will cause that employee to feel pretty negative or pretty down about that conversation, as opposed to approaching that employee and saying, look, the business has about that conversation, as opposed to approaching that employee and saying, look, the business has really been struggling lately. You can see that our customers haven't been engaged, that there's all these other issues going on. I think, there's some other issues going on here as well, but one of them may be that, there might be some tips we can give you or some performance routes we can go down to, really put you on the best foot. Having that sort of conversation like that can be a lot more productive often than simply being matter of fact. Not always, but sometimes that can be as well. Having really good emotional intelligence, again, often a very hard thing to do, particularly with new employees or employees who are going through personal struggles, but don't often say that to the employer. It can be hard to do that sometimes, but really considering what are the emotional effects of what I'm saying and what this employee may be having or may be receiving, and reacting to an employee. And what I mean by that is that when an employee reacts negatively or says something that may ring some alarm bells about them being bullied, reacting to that, not just leaving it where it is, but saying to the employee, oh, can you expand that a little bit more? What would you like us to do about that? Whatever conversation it may be, you don't necessarily have to do what they say, but at least given the opportunity to hear that you understand what they're saying often goes a very, very long way towards negating a lot of the issues that these employees feel. What are some signs that conversations aren't going smoothly? Body language is a big factor. So employees who have crossing arms, clenching their fists, pushing away from somebody, often indications that they're reacting very negatively to that. Avoiding eye contact, or sometimes even too much eye contact as well. Very intense eye contact. Those can also be signs that an employee is having a very strong emotional reaction to what's being said. The tone of voice, if the employee is becoming very shouty, very edgy, muttering under their breath, also very, very clear signs that something's going wrong there. And avoiding a particular topic or just denying any engagement in that particular topic is often a sign that they don't really want to engage in that conversation. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are being bullied, but those are signs to look out for and look at to see whether there are some issues going on, and perhaps to maybe take some additional steps to address those issues. So if those are happening, if you do see some of those signs, what can you do? So this applies not just to having difficult conversations, but also having conversations with an employee who's raised a claim of bullying or raised an allegation of bullying, and talking to a potential offender, a potential person who has been alleged to have been bullied somebody. Having these or using these tips can be very helpful as well. Finding common ground. Why are you having the conversation? Also, what do you want to get out of the conversation? All very important as well. If you both know where the conversation is heading, it can be really, really good to highlight that again to show the employee that you are actually heading in the right direction. Taking a break, stepping out, addressing the issue, stepping back in, also a really good tip. Just for any meeting that's going difficult in general, really, taking a break, allowing somebody 5 or 10 minutes to cool down can also potentially avoid a lot of claims of being bullied or bullying behaviour. Contrast for understanding. So what we mean by that is if an employee says they don't feel comfortable, or they don't think this is fair or reasonable, perhaps contrasting what may be unreasonable, what may be bullying behaviour with what's actually happening, can often demonstrate to somebody what is and what isn't bullying behaviour, comparing their behaviour to somebody else's behaviour, contrasting it in order to enable them to understand it. And the hardest one of all, which is by far the most reluctant action that an employer is willing to take, or an alleged offender is willing to take, is saying sorry, acknowledging that the behaviour may have been unwanted, or may have been unreasonable, or may have caused an employee harm, apologising for that, recognising it, acknowledging it, goes an extremely long way towards resolving these sort of issues. And I've dealt with a great many of claims which have gone on for 6 months, a year, often more than that. And when we finally sit down with the employee and really have a really real conversation with that person, what we find out is that all they wanted was an acknowledgement or an apology for what had happened. And often we can resolve a lot of issues by providing some sort of apology. Not necessarily saying that that the employer or the offender had malicious intent or intends to do something wrong or is a bully, but that the behaviour may have been received negatively, or there may have been a better way to do whatever, or to follow whatever behaviour was followed or done. A really, really powerful tool in terms of resolving these sort of issues. So what do we do when we get an allegation of bullying? We've gone through all these processes, we've had this meeting, an employee raises a claim of bullying, while an employer actually has a legal obligation, as I talked about, to address the issues. And this is generally the process that the authority or the court would expect an employer to follow. So the first step is obviously to meet with the complainant. We really need to understand from their point of view, what is the action that they're complaining about? What is the claim that they're really making, or what is the negative effect that they're claiming? Having a face-to-face meeting with them can be a really, really powerful tool to extract that, but also asking them to put their concerns in writing. That can help a lot as well. Often a lot of people will be reluctant to put their concerns in writing, but it can be a powerful tool to really clear up what needs to be addressed. Once you understand what the complaint is, then meeting with the employee that the allegations have been made against, so meeting with the alleged offender. And this can be a really difficult conversation to have, but is a really important one to have, putting the allegations to them, saying that this person has made a complaint, this is what they're alleging, what's your response to that? And just being really open-minded with that, listening to what they have to say, and not making a judgment call at that time can make that meeting go a lot more smoothly. So just letting that person react to that, allowing them to put forward their story, their side of what happened, and then going away to think about that response before you react, can also be, or ensure that the process is conducted in a more fair way. There may also be witnesses that need to be interviewed. So if you know that other people were present in some of the instances of bullying or unwanted behaviour, talking to those people, getting their allegation or getting their version of events in writing, a meeting with them face-to-face can also often shed a lot of light on what a reasonable person may have thought in that circumstance. It can be very difficult sometimes when you've got a victim and an offender to work out who's right and who's wrong, because they often say very, very different things. And it's the third parties, that the people who aren't involved in it, but which witnessed what had happened, that can often give the most powerful evidence. And obviously, if there's any other evidence as well, we want to be looking at that, collecting that, and considering all of that as well. That can include emails, letters, maybe CCTV footage, anything like that, all really good evidence to have. And then going away and looking at all the evidence, considering it with an open mind, and making a determination about whether we think that is bullying behaviour, or even maybe not bullying behaviour, but unnecessary or maybe not appropriate behaviour. And then the important thing about that is it's not just about making that decision, but about communicating that decision to everybody as well. So making sure that the victim knows what the outcome is and how you reach the outcome as well, particularly where it's not the outcome that they may have wanted. Communicating why you got to that outcome can also really help avoid that person taking a claim or taking their complaint further. And if you do find that there was bullying or perhaps unwanted or unreasonable behaviour, then you can obviously go down a disciplinary process for the alleged offender, which may result in a warning, a final warning, rehabilitation, some extra training, some extra awareness, or even termination in some cases. Will always depend on how bad it was, whether it's repeated behaviour, and what exactly has happened. So the ultimate outcome will be very fact dependent, but looking at those different outcomes and considering what those are always really good tips to follow. And then obviously reaching the outcome and hopefully having addressed that issue can hopefully avoid that person taking a claim or taking that matter further. Probably one of the other powerful tools I'll mention here as well that people often forget is you can actually deal with a bullying claim very easily by separating the parties. It's not always possible, particularly for smaller businesses. It's not always possible to separate employees, but if you have another store or you have another location that somebody can work at, or even another part of the building that they can work at, that can always be helpful to separate those people, even if nothing has really gone wrong. Sometimes, cutting off that behaviour or cutting off that communication between those two people can just stop that matter escalating and going forward. And the benefits of creating a safe and healthy workplace are all hopefully really obvious by now. Showing that you're meeting your health and safety obligations, having improved culture and improved environment, lowering injury and illness costs, as well as absenteeism and turnover. It actually saves a lot of time dealing with it proactively. It may seem like it takes a lot of time to deal with these instances, but the sooner you deal with it, the less time it takes. And in the hundreds or 300 or so claims that we've dealt with of bullying, or that I've dealt with at least in bullying, it's always a lot longer if we have to go through the formal process. If we have to go to court, go to the authority, go through a prosecution, that's always going to take a lot more time. It can also show that you can raise morale, show the employee, not just their victim, but also the other employees, that you do really care about them and that you are really considering their views and their place in the business as well. It can set the standard for future employees. So as I said, allowing this stuff to fester often is a cyclical process and creates more and more problems. And obviously it also fosters trust and good faith in the employment relationship as well. And one of the fundamental requirements of an employee and an employer in any employment relationship is that of good faith. So making sure you're being open and communicative, making sure that you're addressing issues in an efficient way, in a speedy way, and at the appropriate time, shows that you are meeting your obligations under the law and under the legislation and to those bodies that may be investigating what had happened. So that's generally in a nutshell, or probably more than that, what you can do in terms of bullying, how you can address those issues, how to identify those issues. As I said, my job in Employsure is to deal with those particular claims, but working alongside me is a huge advice team and a consultancy team who really work with businesses to ensure that we have the right policies in place, we are following the right processes, and that we are heading off these claims as soon as possible. So what we can do is provide general advice, assist with disciplinary actions, performance management processes, assist with any wage issues, documentation, all issues which stem from or which can cause bullying claims. We also manage claims. As I said, that's my main role in Employsure. Ensure that an employer is meeting their health and safety obligations, ensure that they have the right contracts and handbooks in place around bullying and harassment. I really can't emphasize how important that is enough. Having good policy and a good process in place that's actually communicated to an employee will often is a really cheap and fast way to resolve a lot of issues. And it's actually something that's missing from a lot of businesses in New Zealand. So it's really something that I would encourage all businesses to make sure that they have, and also to review on a regular basis. Every 12 months, excuse me, are you looking at those handbooks and those policies to make sure that they're up to date and you're actually dealing with the current culture and environment that your employees are working in. And we also provide insurance, so if an employee were to raise a bullying claim and it were to go all the way to the authority and the authority were to order some compensation, then the insurance can potentially cover that for our clients as well. So, our main job is to ensure that our clients and employers are complying with the Employment Relations Act. I talked about the compliance, making sure you have the right documentations in place, giving advice. So we have a 24-hour phone service available to our clients who can basically call up whenever there's an allegation of bullying or anything else, really, to be honest, and get some really strong advice about where to go from here and how to deal with those sort of issues, and then obviously to have support going through that entire process as well. And the last two boxes there are the main things that I cover. So I deal with insurance. If a claim does arise, then our insurance can cover that claim for our clients. And if in the unlikely circumstance that does go through to the authority or to the court, and it is a minority of claims that really do go all the way, then we can represent our clients in that forum as well. So if you have any questions, if you have any concerns that you may have in your business, anything you want to talk about further, then we'll be in touch with you, and we can always arrange a long conversation to have with you or your business about how we can help. But I think it's really important to be, if I could sum up the main point of this presentation, is to really be on the lookout for instances of bullying and try to deal with it as soon as possible, because that will just save you and your business a whole lot of time and money, and also make that employee feel a lot better about the environment that they're working in, and hopefully not get to the point where they do feel like they have no other options but to resign or but to raise a claim. So that's all I had to say at the moment.